A Motte-and-bailey castle is a fortification with a wooden or stone keep situated on a raised earthwork called a motte, accompanied by an enclosed courtyard, or bailey, surrounded by a protective ditch and palisade. Relatively easy to build with unskilled, often forced, labor, but still militarily formidable. These castles were built across northern Europe from the 10th century onwards, spreading from Normandy and Anjou in France, into the Holy Roman Empire in the 11th century. The Normans introduced the design into England and Wales following their invasion in 1066. Motte-and-bailey castles were adopted in Scotland, Ireland, the Low Countries and Denmark in the 12th and 13th centuries. By the end of the 13th century, the design was largely superseded by alternative forms of fortification, but the earthworks remain a prominent feature in many countries. Architecture. Structures. A Motte-and-bailey castle was made up of two structures, a motte, a type of mound often artificial topped with a wooden or stone structure known as a keep, and at least one bailey, a fortified enclosure built next to the motte. The term Motte-and-bailey is a relatively modern one, and is not medieval in origin. The word motte is the French version of the Latin motta, and in France the word motte was initially an early word for a turf. It then became used to refer to a turf bank, and by the 12th century was used to refer to the castle design itself. The word bailey comes from the Norman French bail, or basse-cour, referring to a low yard. In medieval sources, the Latin term castellum was used to describe the bailey complex within these castles. One contemporary account of these structures comes from Jean de Colmeau around 1130, describing the Calais region in northern France. De Colmeau described how the nobles would build a mound of earth as high as they can and dig a ditch about it as wide and deep as possible. The space on top of the mound is enclosed by a palisade of very strong hewn logs, strengthened at intervals by as many towers as the means can provide. Inside the enclosure is a citadel, or keep, which commands the whole circuit of the defences. The entrance to the fortress is by means of a bridge, which, rising from the outer side of the motte and supported on posts as it ascends, reaches to the top of the mound. At Durham Castle, contemporaries described how the Motte-and-bailey superstructure arose from the tumulus of rising earth, with a keep rising into thin air, strong within and without, with a stalwart house, glittering with beauty in every part. Mottes were made out of earth and flattened on top, and it can be very hard to determine whether a mound is artificial or natural without excavation. Some were also built over older artificial structures, such as Bronze Age barrows. The size of mottes varied considerably, with these mounds being 3 meters to 30 meters in height, and from 30 meters to 90 meters in diameter. This minimum height of 3 meters for mottes is usually intended to exclude smaller mounds which often had non-military purposes. In England and Wales, only 7% of mottes were taller than 10 meters high, 24% were between 10 and 5 meters, and 69% were less than 5 meters tall. A motte was protected by a ditch around it, which would typically have also been a source of the earth and soil for constructing the mound itself. A keep and a protective wall would usually be built on top of the motte. Some walls would be large enough to have a wall walk around them, and the outer walls of the motte and the wall walk could be strengthened by filling in the gap between the wooden walls with earth and stones, allowing it to carry more weight. This was called the garillum. Smaller mottes could only support simple towers with room for a few soldiers, whilst larger mottes could be equipped with a much grander building. Many wooden keeps were designed with a brettach, a square building that overhung from the upper floors of the building, enabling better defenses and a more sturdy structural design. The early 12th century chronicler Lambert of Ardres described the wooden keep on top of the motte at the castle of Ardres, where the first story was on the surface of the ground, where were cellars and granaries, and great boxes, tuns, casks, and other domestic utensils. In the story above were the dwelling and common living rooms of the residence, in which were the larders, the rooms of the bakers and butlers, and the great chamber in which the lord and his wife slept. In the upper story of the house were garret rooms. In this story also the watchmen and the servants appointed to keep the house took their sleep. Wooden structures on mottes could be protected by skins and hides to prevent them being easily set alight during a siege. The bailey was an enclosed courtyard overlooked by the motte and surrounded by a wooden fence called a palisade and another ditch. The bailey was often kidney-shaped to fit against a circular motte, but could be made in other shapes according to the terrain. The bailey would contain a wide number of buildings, including a hall, kitchens, a chapel, barracks, stores, stables, forges or workshops, and was the centre of the castle's economic activity. The bailey was linked to the motte either by a flying bridge stretching between the two, or, more popularly in England, by steps cut into the motte. Typically the ditch of the motte and the bailey joined, forming a figure of 8 around the castle. Wherever possible, nearby streams and rivers would be dammed or diverted, creating water-filled moats, artificial lakes and other forms of water defences. In practice, there was a wide number of variations to this common design. A castle could have more than one bailey. At Warkworth Castle an inner and an outer bailey was constructed, or alternatively, several bailies could flank the motte, as at Windsor Castle. Some bailies had 2 mottes, such as those at Lincoln. Some mottes could be square instead of round, such as at Cabaltrum. Instead of single ditches, occasionally double-ditch defences were built, as seen at Berkhamsted. Local geography and the intent of the builder produced many unique designs. Construction and maintenance. Various methods were used to build mottes. Where a natural hill could be used, scarping could produce a motte without the need to create an artificial mound, but more commonly much of the motte would have to be constructed by hand. 4 methods existed for building a mound and a tower. The mound could either be built first, and a tower placed on top of it. The tower could alternatively be built on the original ground surface and then buried within the mound. The tower could potentially be built on the original ground surface and then partially buried within the mound, the buried part forming a cellar beneath, or the tower could be built first, and the mound added later. Regardless of the sequencing, artificial mottes had to be built by piling up earth. This work was undertaken by hand, using wooden shovels and hand barrows, possibly with picks as well in the later periods. Larger mottes took disproportionately more effort to build than the smaller equivalents, because of the volumes of earth involved. The largest mottes in England, such as Thetford, are estimated to have required up to 24,000 man-days of work. Smaller ones required perhaps as little as 1,000. Contemporary accounts talk of some mottes being built in a matter of days, although these low figures have led to suggestions by historians that either these figures were an underestimate, or that they refer to the construction of a smaller design than that later seen on the sites concerned. Taking into account estimates of the likely available manpower during the period, historians estimate that the larger mottes might have taken between 4 and 9 months to build. This contrasted favorably with stone keeps of the period, which typically took up to 10 years to build. Very little skilled labor was required to build Motte-and-bailey castles, which made them very attractive propositions if forced peasant labor was available, as was the case after the Norman invasion of England, where the local workforce had to be paid, such as at Clones in Ireland built in 1211 using imported laborers. The costs would rise quickly, in this case reaching £20. The type of soil would make a difference to the design of the motte, as clay soils could support a steeper motte, whilst sandier soils meant that a motte would need a more gentle incline. Where available, layers of different sorts of earth, such as clay, gravel and chalk, would be used alternatively to build in strength to the design. Layers of turf could also be added to stabilize the motte as it was built up, or a core of stones placed is the heart of the structure to provide strength. Similar issues applied to the defensive ditches, where designers found that the wider the ditch was dug, the deeper and steeper the sides of the scarp could be, making it more defensive. Although militarily a motte was, as Norman Pounds describes it, almost indestructible, they required frequent maintenance. Soil wash was a problem, particularly with steeper mounds, and mottes could be clad with wood or stone slabs to protect them. Over time, some mottes suffered from subsidence or damage from flooding, requiring repairs and stabilization work. Although Motte-and-bailey castles are the best-known castle design, they were not always the most numerous in any given area. A popular alternative was the ringwork castle, involving a palisade being built on top of a raised earth rampart, protected by a ditch. The choice of Motte-and-bailey ringwork was partially driven by terrain, as mottes were typically built on low ground, and on deeper clay and alluvial soils. Another factor may have been speed, as ringworks were faster to build than mottes. Some ringwork castles were later converted into Motte-and-bailey designs, by filling in the center of the ringwork to produce a flat-topped motte. The reasons for why this decision was taken are unclear. Motte-and-bailey castles may have been felt to be more prestigious, or easier to defend. Another theory is that, like the Turpen in Netherlands, or Voorburg and Hauptburg in Lower Rhineland, raising the height of the castle was done to create a drier site.